My name is Margaret. I'm 62 years old, and I'll never forget the sting of those words. We were gathered in my dining room, a room that has kept our family's laughter and arguments like rings in a tree trunk. Pastel balloons trembled whenever the vent exhaled. I'd tied them to the ladder-back chairs this morning, the knots a little uneven because my thumb aches in damp weather. The chocolate cake, 3 layers, my old recipe with coffee whisked into the batter, sat prepared on the sideboard under a glass dome. Its frosting calmed into neat ridges that caught the light. The air smelled of cocoa and vanilla, with a faint brightness from the bowl of sliced oranges I'd set out to freshen the palate, as my late husband used to say. On the buffet, 2 candles burned low and practical, the kind you buy in a bundle at the grocery store. They threw a soft amber on the framed photographs. Kindergarten art fair, 8th grade band, a beach vacation from a year when we could still afford the nicer hotel. My son David, 36, tall, always polished in his gray blazer, stood under the chandelier where the crystals were careful not to chime. He had crossed his arms, elbow sharp against that jacket he wears to everything from Sunday brunch to funerals, a uniform that says he never forgets he is going somewhere important next. He tilted his chin just slightly, the gesture that means he has decided the conversation needs truth, is truth. His tie, a matte navy, was knotted with the same strictness he applies to his calendar. He looked past me, in that way he has lately, aimed at some imagined horizon where he believes I don't exist. "Mom, let's be honest," he said loudly so everyone could hear. "You're nothing but a memory now. You hold on to the past while the rest of us have moved forward," loud enough to land on the china plates stacked neatly near the silverware, on the edge of the linen tablecloth I ironed this morning, on the throat of my daughter Emily, who swallowed and then looked down. Loud enough to settle in the dust that always collects along the window sash, the dust I meant to wipe before they came but missed when the phone rang and I lost my place. A few chuckles bubbled up like faulty champagne, thin, mean fizz that dies as soon as it touches the tongue. Nervous smiles stretched the room like plastic wrap. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, smoothed the side of her hair the way women do when we feel the room turning and want to look put together for the turning. Her blouse was the palest blue, the color of those hard candies in crystal dishes at dental offices, and for a split second I wanted to offer her a sweater, because the vent above her seat is always too strong. She glanced at David, then at the cake, then at me, as if the sequence itself were a courtesy. Emily lowered her gaze to her lap and found urgent business with the corner of her napkin. She has her father's downturned eyes and my mother's soft, stubborn mouth, 29 and gentle in a way the world mistakes for uncertainty. She pressed a crease into the napkin with her thumbnail until the cloth held the line like a scar. That girl could fold grief until it sits politely on a plate. No one defended me. On my birthday, I was treated as if I didn't matter anymore. The room made a sound I know well, the sound of people deciding what kind of people they are going to be. It is a hush with weight in it, like a heavy quilt that never warmed anyone. The clock on the mantel ticked with polite regularity. The house itself refused to take sides. In the hallway, the runner rug, worn thinner where our feet have preferred the same path for years, lay obedient and mute. Somewhere outside, a car passed with the low grumble of an argument we were not invited to hear. The nearest balloon nudged the back of David's blazer, then shied away like it had learned better. I noticed everything because I needed to notice one thing that could save me, and nothing in the room volunteered for the job. Shock is physical. It isn't a thought. It's a drop in the center of your chest and a flooding along the skin, as if someone has poured a bowl of cold milk down your back. I felt my birthday sash, a ribbon Emily insisted on, gold script that looked like icing, turned from silly to cruel in a heartbeat. The cheap crown they'd set on the sideboard as a joke, the one with plastic gems, gleamed in a way that made me suddenly terribly aware of how you can look like you are celebrating when you are, in fact, being arranged for display. David cleared his throat as if the truth comes with phlegm. I mean, he went on, softer, the way a person leans in to sound reasonable after they've set the fire. We appreciate everything you've done. Of course, but we can't live in your scrapbook. My scrapbook, I said, because sometimes you need to repeat the thing that hurts to see if it was the right size. The two words hung between us like damp laundry. He smiled the professional smile that never touches his eyes. You could frame that smile and put it in a lobby. You know what I mean? No, I thought you don't. Or you do, and the knowing is worse. Melissa moved her hand toward his sleeve, a small bluebird of a gesture, but thought better of it midway, letting her fingers settle instead on the rim of her water glass. She pressed a clear crescent into the condensation, an accidental fingerprint that said, I was here, not speaking. I baked your favorite, I said to no one, then to everyone. My voice sounded like it came from under the table. Devil's food with coffee. The way Dad liked. The way Dad liked. I had meant Thomas, of course. I still say Dad sometimes when I'm talking to our children about their father, though he has been gone 3 years and 2 months and a day. You count these things without deciding to. Thomas used to lean against that doorframe there, one shoulder, and he'd ask me to sneak him the corner slice, so he could pretend he didn't, and I could pretend I didn't notice. He would have stayed in the doorway now, I think, not interrupting but widening the doorway by standing there. Thomas was a man who made space by occupying it. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention, the way it always does when I introduce a ghost into the debate. He does not like ghosts in the same way he does not like outdated software. They are difficult to integrate, and they slow everything down. We appreciate the effort, he said. We came. We're here. As if attendance were affection. I could see the little boy he had been for a flash, the boy whose socks never matched because he dressed in the dark to avoid waking his father on early shift days, the boy who built towers out of VHS tapes because blocks were too expensive that year. He had a mouth like mine then, soft and unresigned. I remembered him sick with a fever once, sleeping on my lap in this very chair, my hand cupping the hot crown of his head so long my palm kept the heat after he cooled. Memory is not a scrapbook, I wanted to tell him. It is the infrastructure of love. But I have learned that some people treat memory like old wallpaper. They remove it with steam and praise themselves for the blankness. David, Emily said quietly, the A in his name stretching out like a hand held across a river. He didn't look at her. She let the syllable drop. It's not a big deal, Melissa offered finally. She braved a glance at me and found a smile that wished to be sincere. I think what David means is, change is hard for everyone. Change, David repeated as if he were making a reservation under that name. I looked at the cake and thought how I had sifted the flour twice, because the recipe said so, because my mother's handwriting said so in the margin of an index card. Sift twice, it makes the crumb fine. I had done that with so many things in my life, sifted twice in the hope the crumb would come out fine, and here was my son telling me the cake was a relic. We should cut it, Melissa said, her voice bright with the brittle light that people hang when a room goes dark. Before the frosting gets, you know. Old David supplied. Fitting. Another little tremulous fizz of laughter, smaller this time. I could feel the room looking for exits that would allow them to leave my side without appearing to move. I thought of the photographs on the wall, how they never laugh, how they keep their mouths in that pre-smile shape, because the photographer cried, "Hold," as if happiness needed to be pinned. In one of them, Thomas holds little Emily. In another, I am cutting a different cake with a different blade, and David's cheeks are puffed from an inhale he never released. We keep those gasps forever. "I'm sorry if I embarrass you," I said, and the apology surprised me because it showed up wearing honesty, not disguise. "With my house, my recipes, my stories." "It's not embarrassment," David said, which is what people say when embarrassment is the only thing in the room wearing a name tag. "It's efficiency, Mom. We can't keep circling back. We've got lives." And I don't. I kept my voice gentle because rage would have given him the luxury of dismissing me as emotional, and I would not hand him any luxuries tonight. "I can have a life." He shifted, irritated by the inconvenience of nuance. "You know what I mean." I looked at his hands. They are practical, square. He has kept his nails neat since he was 12 and decided that his best self never smelled like the locker room. When he was little, he used to press those hands against the window in winter and then look back, triumphant, at the fogged outlines his fingers made. Now his hands rested on the curve of his biceps like security detail. The gray blazer did not wrinkle. The man inside it did. "Let's sing," Emily said, trying to drag the party back to the lane where parties belong. Her voice shook on the second word. She lifted the matchbox automatically, then put it down as if the box were too heavy for this particular night. "We'll sing," David said magnanimously, "after we acknowledge reality." I thought of the word acknowledge. It has the shape of a courtesy, but the bite of a boundary. I thought of all the acknowledgments I have offered this family. I acknowledge your schedules. I acknowledge your diets. I acknowledge your new ways of believing you invented the world. I wondered what it would be like to be acknowledged in return, not as a historic plaque, but as the person who still buys the candles and knows which fork must be turned tines down because the drawer catches otherwise. The balloon grazed his shoulder again, a light knock, the house's most ridiculous attempt at intervention. He flicked it away with an annoyed glance, and the string, relieved, returned to dangling above my chair, its tail just brushing the place where I was meant to sit. "Sit," the string seemed to say. "Be small and seated, birthday girl. Be decor." "I understand," I said. And in that moment I understood that understanding, the thing we lift up as proof of our goodness, is often the first resignation. I tasted chocolate and salt in the back of my throat and realized I had bitten the inside of my cheek so hard I'd drawn a little blood. The flavor was sharp, medicinal, and honest in a way the cake could not be. From the kitchen doorway, a draft pressed against the flame of the candle on the buffet. The flame bent, then corrected itself, then stood a little taller as if embarrassed to have been caught doubting its purpose. "Happy birthday, Mom," David said, but it was the kind of happy that asks you to step aside so the car can pull out of the driveway. "Thank you," I answered, because good manners are sometimes the only sword you're allowed to hold. No one met my eyes for a beat, then another. Finally Emily did, and in her look there was the smallest rebellion, just a tenderness refused departure. Melissa exhaled a careful breath. Somewhere in the house a pipe clicked like a knuckle. The cake waited, undisturbed and perfect for a ceremony that should have been simple. The words he'd said, "You're nothing but a memory," kept ricocheting off the glass dome, off the polished walnut, off the picture frames, until they came back to me thinner but more frequent, like a drip you cannot find the source of. I watched the candle steady itself again. I watched the frosting hold its ridges. I watched the family I had made rehearse the posture of people who would call this a good evening later, because nothing technically broke. "Let's cut," I said at last, and heard, clearly, as if from another room, the sound of a knife being placed on porcelain. The sound a person makes when they are learning the exact weight of a moment and also the exact weight of their own hand. The sound a life makes when it is told, very publicly, that it must now learn how to be historical. The silence cut deeper than his words. Emily, 29, quiet and soft-hearted, looked torn, but she didn't dare confront her brother. And David stood tall, as if humiliating me was some twisted way of proving control. I stepped away, retreating into the kitchen with trembling hands. The doorframe brushed my sleeve the way Thomas used to do when he wanted me to feel his presence without making a scene, just a light touch, enough to say I'm here. My late husband had always taught our children that family was built on respect. But since his passing 3 years ago, the house had learned new acoustics. Voices traveled differently, and authority, missing its gentlest anchor, tried to speak in a lower register to compensate. David's voice had gone especially deep. The kitchen caught me the way a well-made chair catches a tired body. The fluorescent bulb hummed its familiar thin song. The coffee maker's glass carafe held a ring of dark liquid at the bottom, fat as a wedding band. I set my palms on the cool edge of the counter and watched my fingers blanch, watched the color return slowly, like confidence. The smell of chocolate and coffee from the cake mingled with dish soap and lemon, the ordinary truce of a home that has seen both celebration and triage. I opened the cabinet for no reason and then closed it again, the click too loud in the small room. On the fridge, Thomas's old magnet still held a curling grocery list: eggs, yeast, parsley. I hadn't bought yeast in months. There is no one left here who eats bread hot and tearing. I thought of Thomas's hands dusted with flour, the way he blew the excess off his knuckles, and then grinned at the mess he made on the counter like a boy proud of a mischievous snowstorm. When he taught the children to knead, he didn't start with technique. He started with listening. "Feel the dough push back," he'd say. "You're not fighting it, you're meeting it." I stood listening to the ache in me push back. It wasn't fighting me. It was meeting me. "Maybe they really do see me as useless," I whispered to the stainless steel sink. The faucet wore water spots I'd missed this morning, freckles of negligence that suddenly felt like proof. I turned the handle, let a thin line of water run, then held my wrists under it until the chill smoothed the prickling under my skin. The water beaded and slid, a liquid mercy, and when I turned the tap off, the droplets lingered on the steel-like punctuation that knows its sentence is not yet over. In the dining room, voices rose and fell in soft waves. Someone, Melissa, by the cadence, laughed quickly and then stopped, the way a person drags a chair back and decides not to sit after all. A balloon string pinged against the door jamb. China chimed. Emily's voice did not rise. She preserved her quiet the way some people protect a flame cupped in both hands. I tried to be angry at David and couldn't, not yet. The path to anger is direct, but compassion, when it awakens, takes the long way around the block to see what the light looks like from the other side. I remembered the first sign of his coldness. It had never been cruelty first. It was exhaustion shaped into a tool. After Thomas's second round of hospital nights, I found David at the kitchen table, head in his hands, lips moving as he ran numbers. He had been calculating time off, mortgage schedules, insurance deductibles, and the particular calculus of masculine grief that pretends arithmetic can fix a failing heart. When I touched his shoulder, he startled like he'd been caught asking the wrong God for help. He wiped his face briskly with both palms and said, "We have to be efficient, Mom." He was 33 and terrified, and terror often buys the first blazer it can afford. Grief hardened into method. Method turned into posture. Posture graduated into a personality that got promotions and raised eyebrows, and a certain number of compliments that sound like warnings if you tilt your head. Decisive, no nonsense, gets results. At home it translated to, no time for your weak traditions. At least that's the language he thought he needed to speak to keep from drowning. I could hate the grammar without hating the boy who learned it to survive. I pulled open the drawer beside the stove, where tea towels lived stacked like folded weather. Beneath them, a flat, deliberate rectangle waited. The paper inside was crisp enough to cut the air. The envelope's seam ran like a backbone under my fingertips. I pressed my palm over it in a gesture that must have looked like prayer. It wasn't piety. It was inventory. The truth I had held back until tonight had weight. Weight is a kind of promise. I closed the drawer gently, as if sound alone could spill secrets. I had rehearsed lines for weeks, then swallowed them. I told myself I wanted tonight to be about cake and story, not signatures and consequences. But part of me, honest enough to be unflattering, wanted to watch my children without the safety net of knowledge. I wanted to see their reflexes when they thought nothing was at stake but my feelings. Thomas would have told me that was a dangerous test. He was the one who believed we should always grade on generosity. I do, mostly. But even generous people want to know if the love they fed their family was protein or sugar. Tonight, I had proof in a drawer and proof in a dining room, and proof, like fire, begs to be used wisely. The back door's glass caught my reflection, an older woman backlit by the patient glare of the kitchen. I looked like my mother at this angle, her posture straight no matter the weather. After her stroke, she practiced standing every morning by the counter, counting to 60 twice before she allowed herself coffee. A woman must meet her day upright, she'd say, or the day gets ideas. I straightened, not for the mirror, but for her. Footsteps padded down the hall, hesitant and soft. Emily leaned into the doorway, not crossing the threshold yet, as if the linoleum were a border she needed a passport for. "You okay?" she asked, and the question was as careful as placing a sleeping child into a car seat. "I will be," I said, and meant it not as prophecy, but as a plan. Up close her eyes looked like the dark centers of anemones. She tugged at the cuticle of her ring finger, a habit she's had since middle school, and then tucked the hand into the pocket of her skirt to discipline it. "I should have said something," she murmured. "I should have." "You should not punish yourself for not winning a fight that wasn't yours," I said. "Not every silence is cowardice. Some silences are reconnaissance." She tilted her head at that, storing the line the way she stores objects with fragile importance, on a mental shelf labelled for later. A faint smear of ceramic dust rimmed her right thumbnail. She must have thrown a pot this afternoon before she came. She always brings me something she made. A mug with a lip that fits mine, a bowl in the exact green of the old backyard swing. Today she'd set a jar of lemon curd on the counter, the lid covered with a square of floral cloth and tied with twine. Her gifts have the shape of time you can hold. "I'm sorry he said that," she added, voice thinning at the end like thread, pulled through too many stitches. "He doesn't. I mean, he's not always." "I know who your brother is." I reached for her hand, and it came easily. It's one of the few things I know by heart. Her mouth quirked. Melissa tried. "She's juggling him," I said gently. "That's work, not treachery." The compassion that was waking in me rubbed its eyes and sat up straighter. Melissa's blue blouse, her aborted touch, the way she maintained the room's temperature like a thermostat no one bothers to thank. She has learned to soothe David because she loves him, and because soothing him keeps the house from cracking along predictable fault lines. That's not betrayal. It's trage. I could honor the impulse even as I refused to accept the script. "Do you remember when Dad taught you to ride without training wheels?" I asked because sometimes the best way to speak about the present is to give it a better ancestor. Emily smiled, the private one that keeps its lips closed as if happiness were a secret worth guarding. "He didn't run behind you," she said. "He ran ahead and told me to aim for him." "He never chased. He lured, I said, and we both laughed under our breath so the dining room wouldn't hear our gratitude. Another sound from the front of the house, the knife being moved against a plate, a clumsy rehearsal. David's baritone saying something about schedules. I pictured the small grooves along his forehead that had deepened these last years, Worry's signature written in stereogram. If you look another way, it spells fear. He was a boy who hated late buses. Now he is a man who hates late grief. I'll go back in a minute, I told Emily. Take the salad, would you? It wants a companion. She reached for the glass bowl, green leaves shining with olive oil, and then paused when she saw the drawer by the stove half a finger's width open. She has the eye for misalignments that potters and daughters share. She didn't ask. She looked at me, and I gave the smallest shake of my head. The secret was a live animal. Questions would only startle it. She turned with the bowl and left the doorway like a person leaving a chapel, slow, respectful of echoes. Alone again, I found the dishcloth and wiped the water spots from the faucet. Silly task, fruitful task, a mercy a woman can perform for Steele and herself. I aligned the pepper mill with the salt cellar. I turned the handle of the oven so it exactly paralleled the counter's edge. When the world in front of you refuses to square itself, the world within arm's reach can be coaxed into right angles. Thomas used to tease me for this trait, and then quietly straighten the picture frames when I wasn't looking. We made order the way other couples made jokes, together, in series, patient with each other's compulsions. I thought of David in my kitchen at 22, when he'd come home from college after his first humiliating internship review. He'd found me slicing peaches and stood there while I placed a wedge in his palm like an oath. The senior VP said I didn't command a room, he'd said, and I'd watched embarrassment become ambition, as if someone had swapped labels on 2 jars. He began practicing his voice that summer, lower, fewer ums, sentences shaped like staircases. When Thomas asked him to sand the porch rail, he did it the way a person sands a memory, fast, until all grain becomes smooth enough to ignore. He learned that competence protects. I cannot blame him for fortifying the only castle that never fell. In the hallway, the floorboard with the hairline crack announced a step. Melissa appeared carrying a stack of small plates like a penance. I'll just. She started, then stopped when she saw my face. Her eyes reflected the kitchen light, not unkindly. He's not at his best today, she said, and then, because she is honest to a fault when given the opportunity. He's scared, Margaret. They're talking about cuts at the firm. And his father. She closed her eyes quickly, correcting herself. Your husband's anniversary is coming up. He gets sharp. I know, I said. Fear likes the sound of certainty. He's playing it loud. She exhaled, a little as if air had grown expensive. I didn't want today to go like this. Neither did I, but days go how they were raised, I answered, and watched her weigh the sentence in her hands with the plates. I'll make sure the kids don't repeat what he said, she added fiercely. I hear them. You'll teach them the right words, I finished for her. Thank you. She hesitated, then touched my elbow, the briefest mouth-wing of contact. Your cake looks beautiful, she said, meaning more than cake, and left. I took a breath and reached for the matchbox. The sulfur scratch is a tiny violence that lets light happen. I struck one and watched the flame leap, burn blue at its core, then settle at proper candle orange. I held it above the sink, then blew it out, the smoke a clean stripe that smelled like old hymnals and new decisions. I didn't need the match. I needed the action. I needed to remind my body that beginnings can be made by hand. In the drawer, the envelope lay where I'd left it, undemanding, serene the way paper is serene before it becomes utterance. The letters inside were in architecture I had chosen carefully. Rooms built for fairness, for gratitude, for protection against the kind of carelessness that calls itself progress. I touched it again, briefly, a blessing or a warning. I don't know which. From the dining room, Emily started a melody, soft, testing the first 2 notes of the psalm that turns a day into a ritual. It faltered, then steadied, as if she had found the pitch not in her throat, but in her courage. Compassion does that. It puts a hand on your back and says again. In me, it did something else too. It looked at David through the kitchen wall and said, I see the boy inside the man inside the armor. I would not excuse him. But I could understand the engine that powered the blow he had aimed at me. That understanding didn't make me smaller. It made me steadier. I arranged the serving knife and the first plates on a tray, set forks like compass needles at true north. When I lifted the tray, my hands no longer shook. Respect, Thomas taught them, was a structure you continue to maintain even when a winter has cracked its paint. You scrape, you sand, you recoat, and you don't apologize for the noise. I would step back into that room soon enough, carrying sweetness and something harder than sweetness. For now, in the kitchen's brief solitude, I allowed compassion to take its seat beside me. It wasn't there to talk me out of truth. It was there to accompany me as I walked toward it. I turned off the humming light, leaving the kitchen in the quiet brightness that windows make. The faucet, polished by my rag, winked once and then retired to its stainless composure. I placed my palm flat against the doorframe there, where Thomas's shoulder used to fit, and felt the grain of the wood like a pulse. The house did not bless me. Houses don't bless. They receive. I breathed in the lemon and the chocolate and the faint match scent of a promise that had warmed itself, and I waited for the room beyond to take a breath, too. When I returned to the table, the room had rearranged itself around my absence, the way a river skirts a rock it pretends isn't there. Mark was holding court at the head, the seat Richard always favored, as if the chair itself needed a spine, and he'd drawn the conversation into his orbit. His voice, easy and certain, skimmed along the surface of the evening like a confident skater, ignoring the thinness of the ice. Parents these days never know when to step aside, he said, and let the phrase hang like a banner the rest of them could gather beneath. He chuckled as if he'd delivered a punchline, lifted his glass a fraction, and gave the kind of benevolent grin a foreman gives a crew that's doing its best. My grandchildren giggled, delighted by the sound of adult humor, even if they didn't understand the flavor. Laughter trains the palate. You can feed a child contempt disguised as wit, and they will learn to ask for second helpings. The smallest one repeated the phrase, "Step aside," as if trying on a pair of shoes too big for him. He wobbled, and they laughed again, and a new notch was made in the pattern. I felt the first, unmistakable kick of anger then, not the hot, flailing variety, but the clean, narrowing kind that gives everything sharp edges. It slid down the back of my throat and settled where resolve lives, hardening there like a seed you could split a rock with. Anger can be a good instrument when you remember what song it's for. Mark went on with a story about a colleague whose mother just wouldn't let go, and how the team had to manage around it. The words "let go" and "manage" snapped together in my ear like magnets, and out of their click rose the faintest ghost of Richard's laugh, the one he used when people dressed meanness in industry jargon. "Call things by their names," he used to say. "You'll save time later." Disrespect passed down like inheritance. The phrase arrived whole and stood next to me, uninvited but recognizably true. My heart answered in a fast, practical rhythm, workmanlike beats, not the frantic stutter of panic, but the crisp tempo of a body inventorying its tools. I pressed my hands to the back of my chair and felt the grain. Oak, sanded smooth by years of birthdays and griefs. Under my right palm, a small nick where Richard had once dropped a serving fork and swore under his breath, and then kissed the wood as if apology could be absorbed through varnish. I touched that place lightly, like a switch. I looked at my son and saw him lit from within by an energy that wasn't joy. Some people run their lives on triumph, others on fear. Mark's fuel had always been the belief that he could outrun anyone trailing him, including, unfortunately, the people who raised him. He spoke now with that runner's grin, throwing easy elbows, happy to glance back and find the rest of us in the dust. Jessica sat angled toward him, her chair listing a degree in his direction, as if his gravity had nudged it. She smiled along, but it was the kind of smile that is more chore than expression, the lips' version of stacking plates. Necessary, repetitive, tidy. Now and then she cut her eyes toward me, and each time she did it a small apology darted and hid in her lashes. Claire had gone very quiet in the way she does when she's trying not to widen a crack. She kept smoothing the napkin in her lap, ironing it with the heel of her hand until its threads had no choice but to agree with her. I thought of all the nights I stayed awake sewing costumes for school plays, felt fox ears, elasticized waists, a vest lined with satin, because Claire wanted it to feel like the sky on the inside. I remembered the way Mark once stood on a kitchen chair at the age of 10 to read me his part for the spring pageant, his knee knocking the rum in exuberant percussion. I had stitched through midnight that week, and then made pancakes at 6 and then taken the early bus, because the manager had said he couldn't cover my shift if I didn't make the opening count. I remembered every receipt I kept in a shoebox because proof comforts the poor. I remembered the time the hem broke on Mark's jeans an hour before his first middle school dance, and he asked me urgently, "Can you fix it?" Not, "Will you?" Not, "Do you have time?" But, "Can you?" As if I were a force of nature he wanted to believe in. I took the thread between my teeth and bit it, and he watched me with the kind of faith that makes a woman stand straighter than her back, as any right to. I thought of the mortgage I fought to pay when Richard got sick, how the house seemed to expand in square footage with every bill that arrived. Doors receded, hallways grew longer, rooms sprouted strange corners that collected dread like cobwebs. I learned the taste of hospital coffee and the emotional weather of fluorescent light. I became a woman who could speak a doctor's language without giving the language the honor of thinking it knew my husband better than I did. When the first of the big checks bounced, I went to the bank and sat in a chair that had been designed to make you feel grateful for discomfort. I wore my good coat and my stubborn face, and I left with enough grace extended to people like me, not a favor, exactly, but a calculation skewed by someone's lunch hour. And now my own son reduced me to a memory. I felt the words like a draft under a door you thought was closed. Memory, as he meant it, was an attic, dusty, irrelevant, the place you put things when you don't have the courage to throw them away. But memory as I know it is infrastructure. It is the joist you don't see but walk safely over. It is the map drawn in pencil that you keep turning over in your hands, even when someone offers you a flashy GPS that can't find home when the signal fails. Mark launched into another anecdote, this one about a team retreat where the old guard had to be dragged into the present. He mimed the dragging with a grin, and the children squealed at his theatrics. I watched the smallest one copy the gesture, hands looped around an imaginary rope tugging. If he practiced long enough, the rope would become real. That is the trick of repetition. It conjures what it rehearses. Near the cake, the knife lay beside the plates, its blade catching a thin vein of chandelier light. A bright little line ran along its spine like a thought crossing a forehead. I had combed the frosting this morning with the back of a spoon until it made careful waves. The ridges held like patient ribs under a sheet. The cake seemed to be waiting for a ceremony that had been delayed by a speech no one requested. When I lowered myself into my chair, The cushion exhaled in a way that sounded, to me alone, like a question. I set my hands on either side of my plate and felt, more than heard, the thud of my heart against the bone shelf of my breastbone. That beat did not ask whether anger was ladylike. It asked whether justice would find its feet tonight or be told to rest because company was here. Mark, pleased with the room's attention, tipped his head toward me. "Mom, you know I'm right," he said, magnanimous enough to offer me a rope if I wanted to join his camp. "It's a new era. We can't keep doing things the way we did when Dad was around." Richard's name rolled across the table like a coin accidentally dropped into a sermon. I watched heads tilt, throats work, eyes darken. The proper response to the dead is reverence. The honest response is complicated. Mark had turned my husband into a time-stamp. The room waited to see whether I would pick up the coin or pretend not to have heard it. "He loved the old stories," Claire said softly, her first words in minutes. "They made him feel anchored." "Exactly," Mark replied quickly, eager to steer. "Anchors keep you from moving. Anchors keep you from drifting," I said, and my voice, when it came, surprised me by not shaking. "It's a different job." He laughed, an airy sound, and patted the air above the table with a flat palm, the universal sign for calm down, as if dignity were a puddle sloshing out of its container. "We're just having fun, Mom. Don't take everything so personally." How else is a life taken, if not personally? The thought arrived crisp, ready to be spoken. I kept it in my mouth for a moment and tasted the metal of restraint. My tongue found the sore place I'd bitten earlier. Pain makes an honest librarian of the body. It reminds you where you filed your last indignity. Jessica reached for the children's plates, busying herself with portioning fruit, her gestures precise and kind. She angled a strawberry toward the toddler in a way that said, "Here is sweetness that does not wound." I watched the small hand accept it and was struck by the awful arithmetic the night was proposing. For every kindness offered to a child, let there be an equal and opposite lesson in contempt. No, I thought, the table cannot hold both without listing to one side. Outside, somewhere far down the block, a siren wound itself into being and then unwound again, its Doppler sincerity fading. The sound threaded through the dining room like a mistaken proverb. Above us, the chandelier stilled, its crystals playing at being raindrops frozen in their fall. The house listened, the way structures do when speech turns into weather. Mark turned his performance toward the family photographs, as if even the people trapped in frames needed convincing. He gestured once toward the wall where Richard's fishing photo hangs. Richard in his old cap, squint wrinkles road-mapped toward his temples, holding a bass with both hands like a midwife showing off a child. "Nostalgia is a kind of narcotic," Mark said, satisfied with the phrase. "It keeps people from seeing what's next. We need leaders who can look forward." I had followed many leaders in my time, doctors and bankers and foremen, and the mad little calendars of chemotherapy. I knew what looking forward looked like when it was brave and when it was a costume. I knew what it cost to walk into a new month with the rent barely saved because the copay had taken a bite out of the grocery money. I knew what it meant to hold Richard's hand and plan a future that included the right to hope for an ordinary Tuesday. I looked around the table and saw, very clearly, that the future Mark wanted leadership over was one where the people who built the house were asked to leave politely and soon. The anger in me grew, not just for myself, but for what they were teaching the little ones. A curriculum was being drafted in real time. Grandmother is a relic, fathers are headquarters, mothers are maintenance. You could watch the small muscles around the children's mouths trying to understand what to do with that flavor of truth. One reached for his cup, then adjusted it until its cartoon fish faced outward, small control, small order. I recognized the impulse. I live by it. I thought of the Wednesday I sold the gold clasp bracelet Richard gave me our third Christmas. Sold it because the transmission had coughed and died, and the mechanic had said the word rebuilt with the tone of an undertaker measuring a body. I remembered wheeling the lawnmower to the curb and bargaining with a neighbor over $20 because the yard could be hired out for less than gas at the time. I remembered writing checks with a pen that skipped and pressing harder until the blue ink showed an anger I pretended not to have. I remembered keeping the lights on like a ritual and heating soup as if it were a sacrament, and sitting very still some nights because the house itself felt held together by my stillness. And now my son looked at me as if I were a sentimental hazard, a kink in the productivity pipe. I watched him laugh with his children and invite them. Briefly, his laughter. It was a handsome sound, the kind that could convince board members and baristas alike. The unfairness of anger is that it often has to share a roof with admiration. But even admiration has its place. I would not let it talk me out of what I could see plainly. My gaze traveled around the table and landed, one by one, on the faces waiting for me to fade quietly into the background. The neighbor couple we'd invited, it had felt rude not to, smiled with the polite glaze of people caught in a family drama who planned to discuss it on the ride home. Jessica kept arranging and rearranging silverware in front of the smallest child, because doing is safer than witnessing. Claire's throat worked once, twice. Then she lifted her eyes to mine, and her look said, "If you stand, I will steady the air." The pulse in my wrist answered. I set my fingertips lightly on the tablecloth, found the place where the seam runs beneath, and pressed. The cloth gave and then remembered itself, smoothing back into unrumpled certainty. I felt the wood under it, the table Richard sanded the summer after the tornado pulled the maple out of our yard and left its rings open to the sky like vulgar mathematics. He had smoothed the raw edge and shellacked it and said, "We'll eat our way forward from this." We had. We do. Air gathered in my chest, obedient to my decision. The words I needed, the simple utilitarian kind that built scaffolding, arrived and stood in quiet formation. Nothing elaborate. The truth does not need decorations. It needs a clear aisle. I slid my chair back. The scrape of wood on wood was a modest sound, but it cut through the conversation the way a zipper opens a tent to weather. Mark glanced at me, amused, already forming the tutting syllable he would use to put me back in my place. I saw his mouth begin to shape it and felt my anger align, not explosive, not hysterical, but plumb and sure, like a weight hung from a line to find true vertical. A heat rose up my spine, not the heat of shame, but the warmth of an engine catching. Everything I had held, seams and schedules, bills and birthdays, soft hands and hard news, clicked into position in me, a mechanism primed to do the job it was made to do. I understood, in a flash that was oddly gentle, that love does not exclude correction. It requires it. You cannot claim to shepherd a family and then leave its lambs to drink from poisoned jokes. I placed my palm on the back of my chair, the way you touch a friend's shoulder before you speak the thing that cannot go unsaid. I took one breath to tighten the knot on whatever self I was about to spend. And in that moment, I decided, no, tonight, I would not stay silent. I rose to my feet, steadying myself on the edge of the table. The chair legs whispered against the floorboards. No drama, just the clean sound of wood doing its job. And every head tilted as if a magnet had been lifted beneath the tablecloth. "Mark," I said, my voice calm but firm. It surprised me, how level it came out, how it found its shape without help. Since I'm nothing but a memory, perhaps I should share one last one. The room tugged inward. Balloons gave their faint plastic rustle. Fork tines stilled midair. Mark settled back, tipping his glass to his lip and not drinking. He let the rim hover theatrically at the edge of a performance. He wanted the moment to be about his poise. From beneath my chair, I pulled out a small envelope. Cream stock, heavy enough to matter, flap sealed with a neat crescent of glue I'd pressed myself. A line of embossing along the top, a law office letterhead that had felt like armor the first time I held it. I'd kept the envelope under my chair like a fire extinguisher, visible to no one, available to anyone who knew where to reach. The family leaned forward. That lean, a single shared inclination, was its own confession. You can spend an entire childhood trying to teach people to attend, and then paper teaches them in 1 second. Mark smirked. He always prefers levity to humility. "What is this, Mom?" he said, eyebrows making a lightweight ladder for his eyes to climb. "Another old letter." "Read it," I said. I didn't bother to look at him. I turned to Claire, steady Claire with her hands that know where to land, and held the envelope out. "Please." She took it with a carefulness that honored the paper, not out of sentiment, but out of respect for edges. Her thumb slid under the flap with a small, tidy sound, a seam released, not broken. The grandchildren breathed as if words might spook if rushed. Jessica's bracelets went silent on her wrist. Somewhere the HVAC clicked, faithful as always, distributing comfort to people who hadn't earned it tonight. Claire unfolded the letter. The watermark showed itself in the chandelier's narrowing light. A faint compass rose embedded in the fibers, a suggestion that north had been considered here before any of us arrived at this table. Her voice, when she began, was clear and unhurried, the voice she uses to read instructions for assembling something that will be sat upon. "This is to certify," she read, "that the full deed of the Harrison family home and the attached investment account are transferred in entirety to Linda Harrison until her passing. Upon her decision, she may grant or withhold this inheritance as she chooses." The legal phrasing laid itself down across the table like a runner. Each word came with its own weight, measured, notarized, resistant to argument. I watched the sentence reach Mark and settle in his lap like an unwanted cat. He tried to move without disturbing it, then realized he'd have to stand up to shake it off. The room froze, not figuratively. The air itself seemed to lock its knees. Claire kept the letter angled in her hands, as if more text might appear if she were respectful enough. Jessica's mouth made a small O, then closed, then made it again, like a fish discovering glass. The neighbors, 2 chairs down, startled at having wandered into the plot, looked at one another with the stunned politeness of people who will later begin their story with "we had no idea." The youngest grandchild blinked in the slow, thoughtful way toddlers do when they sense that the adults have misplaced something invisible. Mark's smirk collapsed. He blinked twice, clearing an internal screen, perhaps, and then tried to reboot his face into a look he hoped would sell better. "Mom, you mean?" "Yes," I said, locking eyes with him. I let the yes be whole. No flourishes, no apology. This house, this wealth, this future, it's mine to give. And today I was going to announce my decision. The sentence unspooled into the silence and found the far wall, where Richard's photograph hangs, him in his old cap, holding the bass with both hands, grin lines crossing his face like small, earned roads. The glass threw a pale twin of the chandelier back at us, a fragile constellation that has watched so many dinners, so many sentences. I thought how he would have stood now, shoulder to the door frame, amused and alert, confident in the way he trusted me to carry what needed carrying. No one moved. Even the candle flame stiffened, as if the wick had remembered its training. I let the quiet work. Silence is not passive when it is chosen. It is a pressure. It tells people to hear themselves. "Let me see that," Mark said at last, palm out, tome clipped. He stretched his fingers as if the reach itself could change jurisdiction. Claire didn't hand it over. She kept the paper, looked at me, and waited. That obedience, so like her father's best habit, gave me back a breath I hadn't noticed I'd lost. The letter felt loud in the room, louder than Mark's voice had ever been, louder than the siren that sometimes passed our block at this hour. Words like deed, account, transferred, entirety gathered along the table's edge like a quiet jury. I thought of the day those words were made, the bank's printer spitting paper in humble little size, the notary's stamp lifting and falling with the decisive rhythm of a metronome, the attorney's pen, a pleasant weight in the hand, drawing my name across the line with the slow attention one gives to a final scene. I remembered the attorney's office. Fern in the corner with leaves like narrow hands, a carpet square that refused to lay perfectly flat, a painting of a bridge that almost matched a river we once drove past on vacation, a box of tissues placed where wives sit. The attorney, a woman with a sensible watch and a voice that didn't tied up at the end of her sentences, had said, "A life estate preserves use and control. You retain discretion." I had nodded, not because I needed the words, but because women like me nod so that professionals feel properly heard when they are merely catching up. Discretion, I murmured now, not for the room, but for my own confirmation. The syllables felt like a key turning in a well-oiled lock. Why would you? Mark began, then stopped. He was smart enough not to finish a question that made him smaller. He adjusted his cuff, discovered it sat correctly, adjusted it again. His confidence had lost a button, and he was trying to behave as if no one noticed the gap. Jessica's hand rose halfway toward his forearm and landed instead on her napkin. She folded the linen in a crisp diagonal, then another, making a triangle small enough to tuck under the bread plate. Order is the human response to power you cannot move. Claire kept the paper level. Her eyes didn't leave mine. I could see in them the echo of a girl who once stood in our kitchen with clay on her hands, asking me whether a handle should be added before the cup is certain what it wants to hold. This can't be. You didn't. Mark tried again. He wanted a loophole. He wanted a clerical error to blame. I let him search. The dignity of a man rummaging for an exit is a thing you grant by looking squarely at him while he reaches. In the doorway, the neighbor cleared his throat, couldn't find anything to lodge there, and cleared it again. Beyond him, the hall runner waited in its careful length. The house felt variously alive. Pipes conducting their private opera behind the walls, the refrigerator murmuring like someone reassuring themselves, the old oak table radiating the kind of patience only sandpaper and years can teach an object. I thought of the decisions that lead to other decisions. The day Richard and I signed this deed together, the way he had slid the papers toward me first with a smile that said, "You hold us. It's right that you hold this." The mornings we walked the perimeter of the yard after storms, picking up sticks, naming what was salvageable, and what the trash truck would carry toward an unceremonious horizon. The night I told him, breath shallow, eyes stubborn, that I would keep the house even if it meant years of smaller yeses and fewer indulgences, and the way he had said, "Then we'll keep it." It was always we, even when I did it alone. I let my palm rest flat on the table, a touch that felt like both blessing and claiming. The wood was warm where the candle glow had laid its hand. Claire's voice, when she read the final line, "As she chooses," had softened just enough to make the word lift. Choice is a word people pretend to celebrate until its direction displeases them. Mark glanced at the children. The eldest had gone still in the way children do when they sense an adult learning something for the first time. The little one had turned the cake knife's reflection into a trick, opening and closing his mouth to catch the little white spark when the blade tipped. They were absorbing, not asking. Teaching was happening whether anyone deserved the credential. I felt again the purpose of the envelope, not only ledger and law, but curriculum. "Mom," Mark said, choosing a tome like a suit from a rack, holding it up to see if it would fit the moment. He went with reasonable. "You should have talked to me. To us. Decisions like this are mine," I said simply. The word mine did not flare. It held. "I have talked to you, Mark, many times. Tonight you told me what you think I am. This paper tells you what I am. What you are," he repeated, incredulous, dressed as confident. The question found its echo in the chandelier's hung glass. We could have drawn diagrams for him, and still he would have asked. "The owner," I said. "Not queen, not matriarch. Those words ask for deference. Owner asks for respect and requires nothing else." He swallowed. The tendons along his neck rose like lines on a topographical map, revealing a terrain he usually kept smooth. He had always been handsome in a public way. Interview lighting flattering, conference room friendly. Now I watched the private face arriving, the one that wonders what he has learned, and whether it was precisely the wrong lesson, and how many times it carried him where he wanted to go, and also where he should never have gone. "Mom, please," Jessica murmured, plea or prayer or simple wish to lower the room's temperature. She reached for the water pitcher and poured carefully, the thin stream making its bright, identical sound, molecules behaving. The pitcher's glass felt cool against my palm when I took it and poured for myself. A small practice in agency as ordinary as it was instructional. Claire set the letter down, but did not let go. Her fingers rested on the margin-like bookends. She looked at her brother and then back at me, and in her look was not triumph, but a kind of relief. A recognition that a line which had been bent all evening had finally been encouraged to straighten. The neighbors sat very still, doing the quiet math all outsiders do when they sense a family correcting its ledger. I did not hurry. The temptation to fill space is a reflex as powerful as hunger. But this was not hunger. This was syntax, how one sentence changes the possible shape of the next. I listened to my own breath. I could hear the faint rasp where age lives, but also the steadiness that comes from a thing picked up in both hands. Rage creates speeches. Authority creates clarity. I had no interest in speech-making tonight. My eyes flicked to Richard again. The picture had been dusted earlier. A faint crescent of lemon oil caught and released the light at the top of its frame. "Do it cleanly," he would have said, not as a command, but as a kindness. Cleanly is merciful. Cleanly lets the room remain a room when the talk is done. I straightened the letter where Claire had laid it. The embossed compass rose. This time I saw it as something else, not mere design but instruction. You do not wave a compass at people. You hold it. You consult. You proceed. Today, I repeated quietly, I was going to announce my decision. The words landed, not with a crash, but with the satisfying weight of something set exactly where it belongs. The house waited. The table held steady under a dozen hands, some clenched, some open, some very small and perfectly still. The candle pressed its flame upward and found its exact height. And in the breath before any other mouth moved, I stood in the center of my own sentence and let its full measure fill the room. David's face drained. Melissa's mouth fell open. Emily clutched the envelope, stunned. The children sat frozen, finally quiet. I felt the hush arrive like weather, the kind that remakes a room without moving the furniture. It slid over the tablecloth and settled on the silverware, on the ribs of frosting I'd combed with the back of a spoon, on the chandelier's small rain of glass. It found David first. Color backed away from his cheeks as if it had been wrongly applied and the day had come to wipe it clean. A muscle jumped once along his jaw, the only part of him honest enough to admit that something inside had lost its footing. I had planned to divide everything evenly, I continued. I did not raise my voice, because truth never needs to shout. But respect isn't automatic. It's earned. Emily, your kindness has never wavered. To you, I leave the house and the trust. And David, I let the silence become a blade and gave it a moment to find its edge. I leave you with the memory of how you treated me tonight. That's all. The words did not echo. They anchored. They found places in the wood, in the air, in the long thread of our history, and held. I watched them take root behind David's eyes. He swallowed, and the tendons in his neck stood out like book spines, volumes he'd meant to read and never did. He had always believed sentences were tools made to bend, bullet points to manage, narratives to steer. So he tried, even now, to reshape mine as it crossed the table. But some sentences are engineered for load-bearing. They arrive already squared and leveled, and a man who has lived by leverage discovers he owns the wrong set of wrenches. Emily's fingers had gone white around the envelope. She looked at me not with greed, but with the stricken, luminous care of a midwife catching something you can't afford to drop. Her lower lip trembled. She drew it in and steadied it between her teeth. "Mom," she whispered, one thin thread of sound that carried more humility than any speech could have. Melissa's hand hovered above the table, half reaching toward David's sleeve, then retreated to the safety of her napkin, where she folded the linen in sharp, exact triangles, as if order could coax dignity back into the room. The children stared at me the way children look at fire, equal parts gratitude and caution. Their giggles had burnt off. In the wide roundness of their eyes, I saw a new lesson taking shape, something about cause and effect, about what words cost when they are spent cheaply. The smallest one's mouth made a soft O. He closed it when he noticed himself, the way a child shuts a cabinet after seeing what lives there. David's jaw clenched, but he couldn't speak. His arrogance, that agile scaffolding he scrambled up whenever empathy was inconvenient, came apart in tidy segments. You could almost hear the quick-release pins pop, the metal sigh as it folded. For once, the power he held with his words collapsed against the truth. That collapse was not a crash. It was a yielding, the sound a thing makes when it recognizes its superior material. I stood inside the stillness and took an inventory of the moment. The letter lay on the table where Emily had set it down, its watermark a faint compass rose, reminding me that north had always been available. The candle's flame, which had quivered earlier at every draught of disrespect, stood now in its full small height, wick charred to a proper, dignified black. The house seemed to exhale, walls settling, pipes ticking like cooling tin, the refrigerator making that low, companionable hum that has always sounded to me like a promise to keep on. The schadenfreude, let me name it precisely, walked in not as gloating, but as relief wearing iron shoes. It stepped carefully, testing floorboards, testing me. There is a pettiness that mistakes punishment for victory. I have no appetite for it. But there is also a sober, almost liturgical satisfaction when consequence finally arrives on time, in the right clothes, carrying the correct ledger. That is the kind I felt. Not a feast, but a sacrament. Not devouring, but receiving. "Mom," David tried again, and the word fell out of his mouth unvarnished, minus the lacquer of easy authority. He hadn't said the simple name like that in years, not as performance, but as need. "Mom, this is... you can't mean..." "I do," I said. "I mean exactly what I said." He glanced reflexively at the photographs along the wall, as if petitioning a panel of frozen faces who had loved him when he was small and unarmored. Richard's picture watched us from his curved smile, the brim of his cap throwing a familiar shadow. I could feel what my husband would have felt here. Not triumph, not even anger, but the clean relief of a line finely drawn with a ruler instead of a trembling hand. He would have seen our son's pride for what it was, a scaffolding built in a storm, and he would have approved the dismantling, not because he enjoyed the view of it falling, but because he trusted the ground under it. Melissa's mouth opened and closed like a hinge in need of oil. "Margaret," she said, and then stopped, and in her stopping there was decency. She was processing two truths at once, the justice of the moment and the ache of watching the man you love encounter it. She slid a glass of water toward David and did not touch his arm. Restraint, I thought, is also a kind of love. Claire did not speak. She stood with the calm of someone who knows that gratitude, when it is right, is a private muscle. Her eyes met mine and asked, "Are you certain?" I nodded once. Her shoulders dropped the small inch people's shoulders loosen when certainty is offered in the wild. I felt in my body a memory of every softer choice I had made, 1,000 tiny decisions to smooth, to excuse, to interpret generously. Each one a stitch. Tonight was not the unpicking of that labor. It was the final knot. A seam does not prove its strength until it is pulled. We had pulled. It held. A clock in the hall ticked. Elegant, indifferent. I listened to that metronome and sensed how rhythm had returned to a room that had been offbeat all evening. The very air seemed to find its measure. Even the balloon strings, which had been dragging their little static along the backs of chairs, hum at attention, their curls obedient in the corrected atmosphere. David rubbed his thumb along the ridge of his knuckle, a gesture from childhood. He used to do it during spelling tests when the word wouldn't give up its letters. "You're punishing me," he said finally, a statement edged in the brittle defensiveness of a man who fears the truth will use his full name. His voice had none of the strategic warmth he deploys in conference rooms. It had the flatness of someone hearing himself for the first time. "I'm clarifying," I answered. "You called me a memory. I'm ensuring the right memory is the one that stays." He made a small sound that tried to be a laugh and couldn't. He looked to Melissa again. She was making neat folds in the napkin, triangles within triangles, as if geometry could deliver the room from ugliness. Emily's fingers, still at the envelope's edge, loosened by a fraction, enough to let blood return to their tips. The neighbors, their presence now accidental, like a comma that wandered into a sentence it didn't belong to, sat very still. They wore the particular neutrality of people who plan to say we witnessed something solemn and mean it. The older one nodded once, the slightest tilt, as if acknowledging a verdict he had suspected was coming all along. I thought about what had been taught in the last 10 minutes, how the children had just learned that apologies are not always tickets, that respect is not a claims process but a craft, that kindness pays out in unlikely currencies, that when a woman speaks gently and does not retreat, the room is obligated to reorganize around her. I considered how the lesson had also found an older pupil. The man who believed love would always round his sharpness for him. I watched the sharpness begin, finally, to round itself. On the cake, the candle leaned a little, warmed through at its base. Wax had pooled into a small lake with a lip, the kind of imperfection that invites a fingertip and a burn. I felt heat against my face from that patient flame and counted, silently, all the heat I had lived through. Summers without air conditioning when each breath felt like a favor. The furnace's stubborn pilot in winter, coaxed back to life with a prayer and a skewer. The bakery ovens when I took that second job. The fevered nights of Richard's illness when we pressed cool cloths and watched numbers tilt. The heat in the room now was none of those. It was steadier. It belonged. "I won't forget this," David said, which was the truest promise he'd made in months. The words contained complaint, yes, but also a dawning comprehension that forgetting would be the greater loss. "I know," I said. "That's the point." He winced at that, not because I had struck him, but because the answer had aligned with something already forming in him. When truth's edges fit the grooves a person has been trying not to name, the fit is painful. It is also the only fit that holds. I glanced at Emily. "Will you light them?" I asked, nodding toward the candles waiting on the sideboard. She moved as if waking from underwater, struck a match, cupped it to protect the little flame from a draft no one could feel any more, and touched it to each wick. Fire received fire. The candles answered in small golden tongues. When she carried them back, the children leaned forward simultaneously, awed back into their proper awe by ritual. The soft song began, tentative at first, then steadying, as voices decided together that ceremony would proceed. Even David sang the first 3 words, "Habit is a powerful usher." His voice thinned at the middle of the line, and silence took his place without scolding him. Melissa sang, clear, careful, her alto holding a path open in the melody for those who faltered. As they sang, I let my eyes travel across each face. I did not look for remorse or for vindication like a collector hunting a rare stamp. I looked for an alignment, the way picture frames square themselves to the line of the mantel after a house stops trembling. In Emily, I saw gratitude braided tightly with disbelief, and behind both, a humility that will not let itself be dramatic. In Melissa, I saw a vigilant kindness, already drafting new house rules for the boys, rules about tone, about pauses, about how we do not make the joke when the joke costs a person. In the children, I saw a dawning, something like a sunrise over a city that didn't know it had mountains. In David, I saw, for the first time in a long time, the boy who hated to disappoint me more than he hated to be wrong. The last note hovered and then found its floor. "Make a wish," someone said, the sentence we say to keep from saying the ones we can't. I leaned in. The candles warmed my face. For a second, the flame pulled the room into its own small weather, a clear circle of air where heat shimmered and time hesitated. My wish was not magic. It was infrastructural. I wished not for transformation, but for maintenance, that the line we had drawn would be repainted as needed, that the lesson we had placed on the table would not be cleared with the dishes, that the memory he would carry would stay accurate and heavy and useful. I wished that respect would be the plumbing we never see and always rely on, the quiet system that moves what needs moving and keeps rot from breeding in the walls. I blew out the candles. The smoke rose in slender gray ropes, twining, lifting, then loosening into nothing you could point to and everything you could smell. The room let out the collective breath it had been saving up for later. The weight on my chest lifted, not vanished, but shifted into the correct harness. Burdens are not lighter when you deny them. They are lighter when they belong on the shoulders built to carry them. We sat in that thinner air, not purified but clarified. The cake waited for the knife. The letter lay between us like a small, precise weather system that had done its job. I rested my palm on the table as if blessing a patient after good news. My gift wasn't just the deed. It was the lesson. Family is built on respect, not entitlement. Around us, the house resumed its ordinary courage. Somewhere deep in the walls a pipe clicked, modestly victorious. The chandelier surrendered its glitter back to the room. And in the quiet that followed, justice did what it always does when invited in properly. It sat down, unshowy and permanent, and made a place for love beside it.